Hello everyone. Tonight, we're going to visit a time when the concept of childhood still slept in the shadows of history. Where being born was less of a beginning and more of a silent sentence. If you're ready, or just too tired to think, give in. You can close your eyes if you want, I'll take you there. In the meantime, if this atmosphere has already begun to envelop your mind, then perhaps you'd like to be a part of this ritual with me. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you want, share in the comments which city you're listening from and what time it is now. It's always beautiful to see how, in silence, we are connected by this nocturnal thread. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Picture a dirt floor. A candle flickers on the wall of a narrow hut. Outside, the wind moans through the cracks in the old timbers. Inside, a woman lies on rough cloths. She breathes heavily. There are no doctors, only the midwife, the smell of blood, and the creaking of the wood beneath hurried feet. A new body enters the world small, wet, fragile. No one smiles. No one celebrates. The baby is washed with well water. It is cold. The air is thick, full of the smell of iron, sweat, and herbs. Still nameless, he is wrapped in a coarse cloth and laid in a straw basket. His mother, pale, is already praying for his soul, because she knows he may not last until the end of the afternoon. Childhood, at that time, was not a rite. It was an interval. You hear, in the distance, the sound of the bucket falling into the well. A hiss, then footstep. The smell of damp straw under the body mixes with the smoke from the fire that is almost out. And a whisper echo. He is already 7. He can pull the plough now, 7 years old. And already a useful body. Today, we will walk slowly through muddy alleys, feel the cold rain on our skin and the smell of the earth we have trodden, share the silence of a hungry child, and perhaps discover that the past is not as distant as it seems, because, in a way, we all still carry the shadow of that denied childhood. But what was it like to be a child in a time when there was no name for it, where there were no toys, no school, no gentle words, only tasks, silences, and small punishments that shake the soul as if sculpting stone? Back then, people weren't baptized out of faith, they were baptized out of fear. Even before their eyes were fully open, the soul needed to be saved quickly because fragile bodies weren't made to last. Each new birth was a secret whispered on the edge of nowhere, an uncertain bet between clay and heaven. There was no sound of the word childhood, not in the common vocabulary, not in letters, not in books. It was as if being small was just an unfinished version of being an adult. The clothes, the gestures, the obligations, everything mirrored, everything compressed. Children were smaller shadows of their parents, but without a voice of their own, with no room for error. And when you made a mistake, there was punishment. Quick, sharp, a tug, a stick, a short cry that echoed inside. Because it was believed that evil was torn out early, that the soul needed to be bent like a still hot iron. There was more fear than affection, more vigilance than embrace. But sometimes, on the edge of all this, an almost magical moment would appear. A small twig that became a sword, a piece of cloth that became a cape. The children's world improvised its own breathing space. Even if it was brief, even if it was hidden, playing was a risk. And yet, it was resistance. So tell me, or just think there, in your quiet corner, what would it be like to grow up in a time where time didn't belong to you, where the days came without promises, and the nights without stories, where sleep was light, watched, and dreams didn't always come? The chill of dawn is still in the air. The sky is a grey blanket without stars. Inside a small wooden house, covered in moss at the edges and smelling of damp inside, a woman bends over dirty cloths. She is in labor. There is no silence, only the sound of her ragged breathing, the crackle of the burning logs, and the hurried murmur of the midwife. Birth in those days was not a blessing. It was more of a risk, almost a sentence. There were no hospitals, no clean beds, just the dirt floor, the calloused hands of the woman who helped, and a trembling faith next to the candle flame. It was common for the baby's first cry to also be the last sound that would be heard from him. And yet, each birth followed an ancient ritual, as if time had no choice but to repeat the same cycle of pain and uncertainty. The baby was born covered in blood and silent. It was cleaned with cloths that had been used for other births, sometimes with water taken from a murky well. The cord was cut with any knife heated in a flame. Nothing was sterile. Nothing was guaranteed. And that was why there was such a rush to baptize. Because, for those people, not baptizing was risking a soul to eternal damnation. No one waited. No one chose a name with care. A name was thrown like someone throwing a rope into the sea in the hope that something, anything, would be saved. There were no statistics, but everyone knew the fear. It was common to lose 3 or 4 children before one survived. Mothers cried alone. Midwives kept quiet. And the world went on, as if the pain were part of the wood of the house, the dust on the ground, the salt in the bread. Sometimes the baby's body was buried next to the house in silence. Sometimes no grave was even dug, because it was just a small body, and almost someone, a shadow that passed. There was a curious detail. The church bells rang to announce a birth, but not for joy. It was so that the angels would hear. It was a warning, a plea for mercy, an attempt to pierce the sky with sound, in the hope that something would change, that this child would be the exception, that he would live, that he would not die the following week of fever, cough, or worms, because diseases arrived like ghosts without warning and without cure. And even when the baby survived, there was no rest. The small body was quickly trained to resist. Breast milk, when there was any, was weak. Sometimes the mother had already died. Goat's milk was used, or even another woman, if the baby was lucky. But hunger was constant, and the child's eyes grew before the body. Alert, frightened, precocious eyes, because they knew somehow that life was a difficult task from first breath. Women also paid the price. Births that would be simple today were fatal there. Hemorrhages, infections, laceration. There were no cesareans. There was no help. There were prayers. And when the mother died, the baby was given to another woman or left to chance. There were many cases of children being breastfed by neighbors. It was a silent survival network where love mixed with instinct, and affection was a rare luxury. In the popular imagination, being born meant entering into a struggle. From the very beginning, there was no time to celebrate. The child's body was wrapped and placed near the fire. If it cried a lot, it was a sign that it might live. If it remained quiet, everyone looked at each other in silence. Silence was the omen. It was fear. It was the wait for the nameless death. Faith served as consolation. Holy water was applied to the baby's forehead. A piece of cloth with excerpts from Psalms was tied around it. A small amulet was placed next to the improvised crib. The crib was actually a box, or basket, or simply a corner with dry straw. The closest thing to comfort was the mother's warmth. And sometimes there wasn't even that. But was there love? There was. Even if hidden, even if contained. Mothers loved with fear. Fathers with distance. Love was unspoken. It was an extra blanket, a piece of bread saved, a long, silent look at night while everyone slept. Because loving was dangerous. It was risky. It created bonds with someone who could leave at any moment. Birth, then, was more than a beginning. It was a test. It was the first crossing. A narrow portal between nothing and almost. And whoever passed through it carried forever on their body the mark of that time. A time where living was not guaranteed. It was a silent privilege. A persistent coincidence. There were no words, no concepts, not even an idea to name that fragile stage between being born and growing up. Childhood, in the Middle Ages, was an unspoken interval, a time spanned as if it were a dark corridor between 2 illuminated rooms. You were a baby, and soon after, you were a person, small, but a person, with tasks, with demands, without the right to pretend to be something you were not yet. Language reveals what is valued, and at that time, the language did not say child as we do today. There were vague terms, sometimes pejorative, sometimes generic, but there was no word that conveyed affection, protection, or recognition. That says a lot. Because when something is not named, it is not seen. And when it is not seen, it is not cared for. The paintings, the manuscripts, the stained glass windows in churches, almost all of them portrayed children as miniature adults. Their clothes, their faces, their gestures. There was no symbolic difference. There was no room for them to be what they were. A 7-year-old boy could be holding a hoe. An 8-year-old girl could be holding a baby. And that was natural, or at least expected. But how did this nameless child feel? Without space, without time to be light. Maybe she looked at the sky and asked something just with her gaze. Maybe she pretended to be something else when no one was looking. Maybe, inside her, there was a world that would never be translated. Because there was no place, no ears, no time for useless questions. Growing up was urgent, and there was silence. A thick silence that enveloped everything. The children didn't talk much. There was no encouragement to explore, ask questions, or imagine. Imagination was viewed with suspicion. Loud laughter could attract the evil eye. Curiosity was a dangerous gift, so they kept quiet. And by keeping quiet, they disappeared. Sometimes when there was time to spare, or when vigilance was distracted, a moment of invention would appear. A twig that turned into a doll, a piece of charcoal drawing on the dirt floor. But these moments were like drops of honey in a sea of salt. Rare, sweet, and soon swept away by the wave of chores, shouts, and punishment. The absence of a word shapes the inner world. When we don't know how to name what we are, what we feel, what we desire, we are adrift. Medieval childhood was that sea without a map, a time where dreams had no shape, where the body grew before the soul, and where wounds often did not bleed on the outside. The child's body was seen as a tool, small, agile, obedient, and also as a potentially sinful soul. Purity was not seen, but rather risk. The child was treated as someone to be corrected, straightened, molded. For this reason, it was common for them to be punished with the same severity as an adult. There was physical punishment, caning, isolation, forced fasting, because it was believed that salvation required suffering. But in the midst of all this, a spark remained, because even without a name, without a word, without rights, childhood insisted on existing. It escaped through the eyes, through the hands that drew in the clay, through the way it ran aimlessly when no one was looking, through the way it hid behind its mother, even when she had no arms to protect it. Today, when we think about this, perhaps we can feel something moving within us, as if an ancient child awakened in our chest, asking for a name, a voice, and a memory. And that is why we tell these stories, to remember, to restore, to welcome even those whom history has forgotten. There were no toys as we know them, no free time marked by schedules. For a medieval child, playing was a gap, a stolen space, a break gained between one task and another, between a punishment and the next obligation. It was necessary to invent play with what was available. Twigs, stones, pieces of cloth, dry bones. Nothing was safe, nothing was guaranteed. Objects that were used for playing could also hurt. A sharp piece of wood became a sword. A strip of leather became a whip. Risk was part of the scenery, not because there was any intention of danger, but because danger was already a landscape, and games were born within him, like stubborn flowers among rocks. There were also fights. Boys faced each other in improvised duels with sticks and shields made from old baskets. The girls, in turn, simulated maternal care, carrying cloths as if they were children, imitating the gestures of adult women. It was a childhood made of copies, a theatre where the future was already rehearsed in silence. And yet, there was laughter, there was running, there was sweat. But this could not be done for long. Adults were constantly vigilant, and playing, when seen as a waste of time, was punished. A boy who laughed loudly could be reprimanded for attracting spirits. A girl who shied away from her homework to play was called a rebel, because there was an ancestral fear that childhood would get out of control. As if chaos could enter through the crack of laughter, the stories passed down by word of mouth were also loaded with warnings. There were tales of children who played too much and were carried away by creatures of the forest, evil fairies, enchanted wolves, spirits in disguise. Everything seemed to conspire against excessive lightness. Loud laughter was an invitation unexpected. A relaxed body was an easy target. Still, there was one type of play that endured. When the rain beat down on the rooftops and work had to wait, children hid under the tables and created worlds. They made huts out of cloaks. They created names for invisible animals. They transformed the darkness into a forest, and time, for a moment, forgot to run. They also played with the elements: water, clay, wind, fire, blowing games, running in the mud, climbing dry trees. But all of this required care. The body could slip, hurt itself, fall, and there wasn't always anyone to take care of it afterward. Scraped knees were no cause for consolation. They were a sign that one had been too distracted, that one deserved the pain. Even so, even when supervised, games had their own way of emerging. They infiltrated the task. While carrying water, children could compete to see who could spill the least. While washing clothes in the river, they invented songs to set the rhythm. Playing then hid itself within the routine, camouflaged, adapted, alive. And this reveals something essential. The desire for lightness is ancient. The need to create, to imagine, to laugh even in the midst of scarcity is not a modern privilege. It is a force that springs even from hard soil, because playing for those children was perhaps the only way to exist beyond utility. It was a brief chance to be, but being at that time also had its limits. And soon the call would return. A scream, a stern look, a weight placed back on the small shoulders. Childhood would return to its hiding place, and the hands that now threw stones would go back to carrying buckets. The sound of laughter would fade, like a candle blown out too soon. And yet, we must ask ourselves, what remains of a childhood where playing was risky? Perhaps only the memory of the moment, of the brief moment when the world seemed light, And it is in this gap of light that the images emerged that led us to the next step. Because just ahead, those hands that played become useful for something harder. It's time to follow that narrow path and watch what happens when the game ends. When the little hands stop playing and start serving. That's where we're going now. Slowly, no rush. The hands that once grabbed twigs to invent worlds now carry buckets. They are small, but already calloused, dirty with dirt, grease, and blood. The nails are often torn out by the force of repetition. The fingers are deformed before they even grow fully. There is no choice. Those hands must serve. Medieval childhood was called to work early. At 6 or 7 years of age, the child's body was already included in the gears of the day. There was no pause. The fields called. The fiefs demanded. The lords ordered. And parents often saw this as an inevitable destiny. To work was to survive, and survival allowed no doubt. The task varied. Some put smaller ploughs, adapted to their fragile bodies. Others carried water along muddy trails. There were those who fetched firewood from the forest. There were those who scared birds away from the wheat. There were those who rubbed cloths on the stones in the river. Each gesture was an exercise in repetition, a rehearsal for adulthood, but also a silent theft of time to be light. Inside the houses, the work was different, but no less demanding. The girls learned to spin wool, sew, and prepare food. Their small hands were useful in detailed tasks such as cleaning animal intestines to make sausages, or separating seeds one by one. Precision was demanded harshly. Mistakes were punished with a look or a cane. It was as if each child was molded to serve the adult world, not as a part, but as an instrument, as a cog. Work was not taught as a value. It was imposed as a sacred duty, something that preceded the word, that came before the thought, that was already there, as part of the body, as part of the air. Sometimes, between one task and another, the child would look up. He would see the sky, a bird, a swaying branch, and he would think about something he couldn't say, a vague desire not to be there, to escape, to run. But the voice wouldn't come out, because the world wouldn't let him. The world kept saying, "You're good enough. You can handle it. You were born for this." And it was hard to disagree, because everyone around me lived the same way. Generations had passed in silence. Grandparents had pulled ploughs. Fathers had hauled firewood. Now it was their turn, and the cycle repeated itself, almost like music played too softly to hear I was there. But I was there, and it hurt. There was something even harder. Sometimes the work wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Children were tasked with taking care of younger siblings, of the elderly, of the sick. They became little adults, responsible for lives they didn't understand. Childhood then bent, dissolved, became a blurred line between birth and obedience. Even in the wealthiest families, child labor existed. It just changed in form. Boys learned the tasks of their father's trade, girls their mother's ways. There were disciplines, timetables, routines. Everything was calculated so that there would be no gaps. Because emptiness was frightening. Because silence could bring question. And there was no room for doubt. But if we look closely, we might see something else. A spark, a silent resistance, a small gesture of refusal. Like a boy who hides a pebble in his pocket, or a girl who sings softly while she works. Because the body obeys, but the soul sometimes escapes. And it is in this escape that dreams live. Muffled dreams, but alive, like embers beneath the ashes. And if these little hands resist fatigue, it is because they carry something that has not yet been taken away. Something that will take us to the next part of this journey. A time when what was missing was everything. A time of hunger. Hunger was not an event. It was the backdrop. It was in everything. In the faint smell of thin porridge. In the dry sound of an empty stomach. In the dull color of skin. In the hands that trembled as they kneaded a piece of rock-hard bread. For a child in the Middle Ages, eating was not a rite. It was an accident. In the morning, the meal might be a sip of water with flour. Sometimes a little milk, if the cow had recently calved. Lunch, when there was any, was a soup of tired vegetable, boiled until it lost its taste. Pieces of bread were dipped in the liquid to soften what could not be chewed. Dinner was rare, a piece of over-aged cheese, an overripe fruit, a root. And when the harvest failed, when the winter was long, hunger took another form. More crawl. Children begged at the markets, sneaked between stalls to pick up scraps. They waited for adults to be distracted so they could try to grab an apple peel, an ear of corn with a worm in it, a piece of meat with more bone than substance. Eating was a furtive gesture, almost always shameful. In poorer homes, the table was symbolic because there wasn't always anything to put on it. People ate on the floor, with their hands, in silence. Sometimes a plate was shared between 4 or 5 siblings. The oldest served first, the youngest cried afterward, and the mother's eyes were almost always fixed on a distant point, as if the absence of food could be endured by not looking. The fasts were not religious, they were forced, and they came frequently. 1, 2, 3 days without food. The child learned to sleep with emptiness, dealing with dizziness, chewing the tongue to trick the body, imagining flavors, creating invisible banquets before closing the eyes. The stomach became a cave, dark, echoing. There were those who ate dirt, clay, tree bark, bitter seeds, insects, whatever was within reach, not out of explicit desperation, but out of a kind of custom, because hunger became a landscape, part of everyday life, something that was not questioned. It was simply lived through, and when there was food, it was still risky. Food was poorly preserved, spoiled, fermented. Many people got sick. They vomited, they died, their stomachs swelled, their bodies weakened, and even then, it was better than nothing. It was a short-lived pleasure, a break from suffering. It was worth the risk. Religious festivals sometimes brought relief. Bread, soup, and leftovers were distributed. Children ran to the churches, stood in lines, and held out their hands. But there was no certainty that they would be seen. They weren't always. The blessing of food was like a coin thrown into the wind. It fell on some. It escaped others. Still, even with the hunger present, there were gestures of sharing. Children shared what they had. A bit of bitten bread, a little safe milk, a fruit pit, and in that simple act, there lived a resistance, a tenderness, a primitive way of saying, I see you, you matter. Hunger, then, was more than the absence of food. It was a language, a trace of time, a way of living, but also a way of feeling less, expecting less, wanting less, because wanting at that time was a luxury, and hope, when it came, was small, like a grain lost at the bottom of a sack. But despite everything, there were nights when my stomach hurt less, when a handful of food seemed enough, when my body slept anyway. And it is in this space between emptiness and rest that we continue now, because after eating a little, it was time to lie down, to try to sleep. And in this sleep, other threats awaited. After a day of chores and a silent stomach, the body finally gave in. Not from rest, but from exhaustion. Sleep came without warning. There were no made beds, no clean blanket, no soft pillows. There was a floor, there was straw, there was the corner of a bar, or the hollow of a staircase. That was where many children fell asleep. The sleeping space was shared with animals, chickens, pigs, dogs. Their warmth helped on cold nights, but it also brought fleas, ticks, and diseases. The smell was dense, a mixture of dried manure, old smoke, and children's sweat. People slept huddled together to fit into the small space, and also to avoid the cold that came in through the cracks. The night back then was truly dark. Candlelight didn't reach every corner. Shadows took shape, and sounds, volume, wood creaking, rats rustling, wind whistling. Everything seemed to have life, and to a child, every sound was a warning, an alert, a fear whispering close to the ear. Many slept fully clothed, not out of habit, but out of necessity. One had to be ready to flee, to protect oneself, to keep warm. The clothes were the same as those of the day, torn, dirty, hardened by time, and the body, even tired, found it hard to give in, because sleeping was also letting one's guard down, and the world did not forgive those who dreamed too much. Before going to bed, people would pray, a short, memorized prayer, said with half-closed eyes. It was a request, a shield, a silent pact with something greater, because the night could bring illness, spirits, thieves, animals, and for many, death. Dying in one's sleep was seen as a blessing, but also as fear, because there wasn't always time to say goodbye. Children learned to sleep in silence, without crying, without moving too much, so as not to disturb, so as not to draw attention. Those who woke up too much were reprimanded. Those who dreamed loudly were corrected. Sleep was functional. It had to serve the body. It had to respect the house. There was no room for delusions or noisy nightmares. And the nightmares came, frequently. Children woke up scared, not knowing where they were. They mistook rats for hands, sounds for screams, the dark for absence. And they stayed there, motionless, waiting for the sensation to pass, waiting for their breathing to return to its rhythm, for their eyes to adjust, for the fear to retreat. Sometimes you slept in a group, brothers lying together, an involuntary hug, a shared warmth, and that, in a way, was comfort. Even without words, even without explicit affection, it was a form of prison, a thread of humanity insisting on maintaining itself, a silent gesture that said, I am here. But not all nights were like this. Some were cut short by fevers, by coughs, by unwanted visitors, by muffled screams, by heavy footsteps. by silences darker than darkness itself. And in those moments, sleep was torn apart, interrupted, and the child's body once again had to resist. Sleeping then was not peace. It was a task. It was an attempt. It was part of the effort to move on. And even so, there were nights when a breeze would come through the window and provide relief, when the sky would be clear, when the stars would twinkle as if watching. And in that moment, however brief, something inside the child would sigh, as if to say, maybe tomorrow will be less difficult. And tomorrow arrived, with light filtering through the wooden door, with the sound of footsteps, with the smell of the day beginning. It was time to wake up, to get up, to pretend that the rest was enough, and move on, because now the light of day would bring another kind of pain, a pain made of letters, of rods, of punishment. The sun hadn't even touched the tops of the houses, but it was time to learn, or at least that's what they used to say, because what they called school, for many children, was a place where pain walked side by side with the lesson, and where knowledge often arrived at the end of a stick. Not all children attended these places. In fact, few could. Learning was a privilege, almost always reserved for boys, children of clergymen, of merchants, of lesser nobles. Girls, for the most part, stayed at home. They learned to be silent, to embroider, by serving. Female knowledge was shaped with thread and prayer. In the cramped, windowless room, the sound of leather cutting through the air was as common as the sound of words being spelled out. The benches were hard, hands trembled, and eyes often got lost in the texture of the wall, because fear distracted. The body ached, and the spirit inside shrank. The spanking was the silent teacher. When the master's voice grew tired, she stepped in. She corrected mistakes. She erased distractions. She drew the lesson on the flesh. Sometimes the punishment came even before the doubt, because making mistakes was not part of the path. It was a sin. It was weakness. It was something to be quickly torn away. Even so, there were those who learned, those who, amidst tears and silence, discovered the sound of letters, the rhythm of psalms, the logic of numbers. And in those rare moments, their eyes would shine, as if, for an instant, knowledge would set them free, as if the word, once understood, would give a name to the world and space to the soul. But soon came the correction, the return to the norm, the reminder that knowledge was to serve, to repeat, to obey. Questions were dangerous. Imagination was suspect. Creativity was almost a deviation. Everything had to fit the mold, be predictable, be domesticated. For girls who had some access to education, the focus was different. There was no arithmetic, no philosophy. There was prayer. There was singing. There was the silence of stitching and embroidery. Everything that was useful for the image of a future wife or a future nun. The letters came along with the threads, and the thread sewed not only the fabric, but also the behavior. And for those who didn't go to school, learning happened in the body, in gestures, in routine. It was a pedagogy of example, of the gaze, of mistakes punished without explanation. Children who had never held a book learned to distinguish seeds, to recognize medicines, to care for animals. Profound knowledge, but without a name, without honor, without record. The lack of affection in teaching left its mark. Knowledge, when mixed with fear, became a prison. And many of those children, even those who learned to read, never opened a book for pleasure, because the book was a reminder of pain, of punishment, of shame. The letters, once drawn in blood, lost their beauty. And yet, there were exceptions. Teachers who, between one harsh gesture and another, offered shelter, a timid compliment, a more patient explanation. And in those rare moments, the room became less cold, less cruel, closer to what we would call teaching today. But these moments were short. Soon came the orders, the silences, the lists, the tests done with fear. And learning, once again, became a burden, not a bridge, not a flight, but a weight. Even so, some children kept their love of learning hidden, silent, like a secret, and they carried it with them throughout their lives. They fed this knowledge as if it were a small flame, protected between their hands, because they knew, deep down, that thinking was dangerous, but it was also the only way to exist inside. The tired body of a medieval child had no respite. When it wasn't work, it was hunger. When it wasn't fear, it was fever. Diseases arrived like unwanted visitors. They entered without knocking, and often they didn't leave. They just took them. They took their strength, their spirit, the sparkle in their eyes, and sometimes their life. High fevers were common. Out of nowhere, the body would heat up. Cheeks would flush. Eyes would bleed. Sweat would soak the woolen clothes. But there were no medicines. There were no diagnoses. There were guesses. And most of all, there was faith. A faith mixed with fear, with misinformation, with despair, One of the most common practices was bloodletting. It was believed that blood carried away bad moods. Illnesses were seen as imbalances, and cutting the skin was the way to restore order. The children were then laid on cloths and had their veins opened. The blood flowed, their eyes closed, and sometimes they never opened again. This was not done out of cruelty. It was out of belief. Parents wept as they held their children. Healers murmured prayers as they sank their blades. Mothers knelt beside them, asking the saints for mercy. It was a scene of pain wrapped in faith, a theatre between what was known and what was expected. Worms were treated with ashes, scabies with urine, plagued with isolation and prayers. The options were few, and trust was cast on the invisible. Plants were used, but not always wisely. Some cured, others made things worse, and almost all of them were accompanied by prayers, because the plant alone was not enough. If the illness persisted, another explanation emerged. Possession, the presence of the devil. A child who screamed too much, convulsed, or struggled was seen as contaminated by greater forces, and when this happened, medicine gave way to exorcism. Prayers intensified. Holy water was poured. Eyes were observed for signs of evil. Punishments also came as a cure. If the evil was internal, it had to be corrected. The body was whipped. Fasting was imposed. Isolation was prescribed. And all of this with the intention of saving, because suffering, in that logic, purified, redeemed. It brought the soul closer to the light. Physical pain was naturalized. A scratch that got infected, a broken leg that didn't heal properly, a tooth pulled without anesthesia. It was all part of life's package, and children learned to deal with it in silence. There was no relief. There was waiting, and the wait was often too long. Still, there were moments of care, a hand on the forehead, a whispered song, an improvised soup. Small gestures, but full of affection, because even among ignorance and superstition, there was love, a painful love, limited, but real, and when the cure came, it was a miracle, it was a celebration, it was proof that the saint had heard, that the prayer had worked. The child was then dressed in clean clothes, taken to church, kneeled in gratitude, as if his or her survival were a living offering, a gift to heaven, but not all of them survived. Many of them slowly went out, like a candle at the end of its wick. The body stopped. Silence filled the house. And then there was mourning. Mourning and the attempt to understand, to justify, to give meaning to the loss. And when no answer was found, the cycle began again. With another child, with another fever, with the same hope. And it is in this hope that we continue. Because as the body healed, another threat emerged. It was not invisible. It was social. It was a transaction made with words and promises. It was childhood being exchanged, sold, offered as currency. When the fever passed, when the body began to walk again, there was a new risk lurking. A risk that did not come from the fields, nor from illness, nor from hunger, but from the decisions made by adults, from agreements sealed over candlelit dinners, from alliances made with promises, because, for many families, the child was more than just a growing being. It was currency. Girls of 7, 8, 9 years old were promised in marriage. Boys of 10, 12, 15 already had fiancés. The unions were not made for love, nor for desire. They were strategies, exchanges, plays on a survival board. A daughter could guarantee a piece of land, a son, a link with a more influential family. The children had no say. They were not consulted. They were only warned. Sometimes not even that. They woke up in one house. They slept in another. They changed their names, their routines, their clothes, and their destiny. A destiny sewn together with threads of interests that they would never fully understand, but from which they would never escape. Weddings were held with simple ceremony. Some were held in churches, others with only murmured blessings and hands clasped together. The girls were white, or the whitest white they could find. The boys were borrowed formal clothes. And there, before the eyes of adults, a commitment was made. After that, childhood ceased to exist completely. If there was any of it left, girls became wives, some mothers, boys became providers, or apprentices, or shields. Lightness disappeared, as if it had never been allowed, as if love always had to wait. But was there love? Sometimes yes. Between silences and obligations, it was born. It grew shy. It learned to exist carefully, like a plant among rocks. But often, it wasn't there. There was only coexistence, rules, routine, cold touches, distance, and a silent acceptance of what was expected. The children knew this could happen to them. They grew up hearing stories of promises, of dowries, of obligations. Some dreamed of escaping, others simply resigned themselves. And when the promise was fulfilled, there was no longer room for surprise, only for adaptation. And what was adapted was the body, the routine, the soul, The girls learned to deal with adult husbands, to endure gestures, to silence desires. The boys learned to protect, to support, to obey, even without understanding the weight of the role they now occupied. There was no time to dream, nor to refuse. To refuse was disobedience. It was dishonor, and sometimes it was punishment, because the family's honor was at stake, and the child in this game was just a piece, a coin thrown on the table of destiny. And yet, there were gaps. Secret glances exchanged, small internal revolts, promises whispered in the dark that, one day, they would do things differently. And perhaps, somehow, some of those promises have survived the centuries, reached here, where we are still trying to understand what that childhood was like. But not all promises led to the altar. Some led to another kind of surrender. A surrender to silence, to seclusion, to the mystery of faith. And that is the path we are following now. To a place where time passed slowly, where bells marked the days, where the sacred enveloped even the smallest. Some children were not promised to husbands or wives. They were promised to God, or to what was understood by Him. In moments of desperation, gratitude, or a promise made in the rain, parents decided to give their children to monastery. It was not abandonment. It was a vow, a pact with the sacred, an attempt to redeem sins, to protect crops, to cure diseases. In exchange, a child was offered. Entering a monastery was not a choice. It was a destiny decided by others, sometimes while still in the womb, other times in the first days of life. And when the age allowed, the child was taken to the gates of the cloister, with a cloth bag, a name on paper, and the silence of the adults as a farewell. Within the high walls, the world was different. There was no play, no family, no familiar smells. There was silence, there was stone, there were voices praying in chorus, in languages that the small body did not yet understand. Time was marked by bells, by rhythmic steps, by tasks. The routine began before the sun. The body woke up to the touch of metal. The face was washed with cold water. The clothes were simple and heavy. There were no mirrors, no colors, only the beige of the cloths, the grey of the walls, the darkness of the corridors. Everything there invited one to forget oneself, to the disappearance of desires. The children, called oblates, were taught to obey, to pray, to copy sacred texts accurately. They learned Latin before they could even name their own feelings. Calligraphy was a drawn prayer. A mistake was a slip of faith. The pen slipping on paper was the most intimate sound allowed. There were moments of singing, contained voices, songs that spoke of the eternal, the invisible, the divine. And there, between one note and another, a kind of consolation appeared, a brief warmth, as if the sound filled the void left by the absence of a hug, of a name called with affection, of affection. But there was not always comfort. The silence was also heavy. The loneliness was painful. Many children did not understand why they were there. They missed the earth under their feet, the smell of home, the noise of their siblings. They were trying to remember their mother's face, their father's tone, but the memory faded with time, like letters washed away by the rain. Punishment existed, even within holy walls. There were reprimands, faults were noted, meals were suspended, prayers were doubled, because discipline was seen as the path to purity, and purity was the only possible destination. There was no room for deviation, nor for rebellion. Childhood was shaped by force, and yet there was beauty. In the old books, in the stained glass windows, in the chants, in the morning light streaming through the crack in the cell. Some found a kind of peace there, a sense of meaning, a shelter from the brutality of the outside world. For them, the monastery was more than a prison. It was a refuge. The children grew up there. They became monks. They changed their names, their voices, their looks, and they forgot that they had once been something else. Other people, someone else. And when they remembered, they did so with the delicacy of someone touching a wound that no longer bleeds, but still hurts. And when, sometimes, a new child arrived, the old eyes watched it with tenderness, with pity, with memory. They knew what was coming. They knew the silence that would envelop it. And if they could, perhaps they would say something. A warning, a comfort, a word. But there, few words were spoken. And so we continued, leaving behind the monastery walls, and returning to the world of homes, streets, and families. Because, even outside of the holy orders, many other children faced ritual, not of faith, but of pain. And it is through these doors that we will now pass. The door of the house closed, and the world inside changed. The medieval home, far from the romantic image of refuge, was often the place where children found their greatest pain. The stone wall muffled the screams, and the wood creaked under the weight of authority. Childhood there was shaped on the basis of obedience, and obedience was taught through pain. The beating was no exception. It was the rule, an automatic reflex, a repeated gesture, a teaching without words. Every mistake, real or presumed, was corrected with the weight of the hand. There was no dialogue, no listening, only the certainty that the cane taught, that the body responded better to pain than to explanation. Some parents used belts, others used sticks. There were those who preferred forced silence and isolation. Children were locked in dark corners, in barns, in attics, small spaces where time stood still and the mind learned to fear. The punishment was physical, but also symbolic. It said, "You are small, and therefore you must bow down." In accounts that have spanned the centuries, stories of children chained up inside their homes appear, not as a monstrous exception, but as an accepted disciplinary method. The chain served to prevent escapes, but also to teach limits, to remind that there was a right place. And right was almost never easy. Pain was justified by the soul. Punishing the body was saving the spirit. So it was said, so it was repeated. The child then grew up believing that he deserved it, that pain was the way, that crying was weakness, that silence was virtue, and joy, a danger that needed to be contained. There was no distinction of age. A 4-year-old boy could be spanked for disobeying. A 5-year-old girl could be spanked for not sitting up straight. Mistakes were measured by the expectations of adults, and expectations were shaped by the rigidity of time. Punishment was not meant to teach. It was meant to dominate. Still, there were mothers who hesitated, who cried in secret after raising their hand, who hugged their children in the dark after being punished by their father. But the cycle continued, because it was what was known, what was expected, what was repeated generation after generation. Some children, however, reacted. They withdrew into themselves. They developed ways to escape with their minds. They created internal worlds, characters, secret refuges. Because if the body could not escape, the mind could. And it was there, in these invisible spaces, that childhood still resisted. Violence was not seen as a problem. It was the norm. It was part of training, of character, of morals. And adults who hit often felt it was their duty to do so. That was what they had been taught. It was what they believed was right. Correcting early to avoid later deviation. Teaching fear before it was too late. And when the marks remained, when the wounds lasted longer than the punishment, there was no complaint, no help, only oblivion. The dust of the days covered the wounds, and life went on, as if nothing had happened, as if silence healed. But not everything was erased. Some memories remained, on their backs, on their hands, in their eyes that learned to lower, in their interrupted dreams, in their affection that took a long time to blossom. And even as adults, many carried the mark of that time, an invisible but profound mark. And it is with this burden that we carry on, because at night, even after the punishment, fear did not sleep. It transformed. It took on other forms, other voices, other faces. And among them, the most frightening were those that came from the darkness, from legend, from threats whispered as a warning. Night fell like a heavy veil over the villages. No electric light, no modern sound, no distraction. The world was plunged into absolute darkness, interrupted only by the glow of the moon or the flickering of a distant candle. And it was in this dark silence that fears took shape, voice, form. Children didn't just fear the cold, or the rats, or loneliness. They feared what adults said lived beyond the door. They feared what lurked behind the curtain, what walked under the bed, what waited around the corner in the hallway. These were stories told as a lesson, as a warning, as a control. There was the forest beast that carried of the disobedient, the old woman on the hill who turned laughing children into stone, the man with iron teeth who cut out the tongues of those who talked too much, and the figure who came in at night to drag his bare feet. Each region had a name, a face, a way of scaring. These creatures did not come at a set time. They could arrive at any moment. All it took was an untimely hiccup, a loud cry, a laugh in the dark. The adults said this naturally, not to joke, but to warn, as if the night had ears, and mistakes were invitations for evil to enter. Fear set in early. The child learned to sleep on his side, to cover his feet, not to ask questions after sunset. There were rules for escaping the shadows, little rituals, a cross drawn with a finger on the forehead, a prayer repeated in a whisper, a piece of bread kept under the pillow. And yet, the nightmares came, and when they came, there wasn't much you could do. Waking up the adults meant risking another punishment. It meant being told that it was all a lie, that it was a lack of faith, that it was drama. So you cried in silence. You hugged yourself. You stared at the dark ceiling until the fear got tired. Some children always dreamed of the same figures, a face without eyes, a repeated sound, a motionless figure. Others saw things they did not dream of. They suddenly felt cold, They heard footsteps. They thought they were being watched, and sometimes they were, by rats, by adults, by secret. Belief in these beings was not fantasy. It was part of culture, part of education. It was part of childhood, not as an imaginative phase, but as a doctrine. Fear was a fence, a limit, an instrument, and adults knew this. They used it. Still, there was affection in stories. Some mothers would tell bedtime stories in soft voices, trying to turn fear into fun. But even there, the threat remained, as if love always needed to be accompanied by vigilance. And what did this do to the child's soul? She grew up suspicious, alert, accustomed to living on alert, to not trusting the dark, to fearing her own thoughts, because thinking about demons was almost the same as calling them. And so it was better to keep quiet, to pretend that she couldn't see, that she couldn't hear, that she couldn't feel. Over time, fear became a memory. It settled in the body. It shaped gestures, looks, postures. It became part of everyday life, invisible but present, like a veil over the world. And even when the legends lost strength, the silence of the night continued to carry something that could not be named, but that could be felt, and that accompanied the children into adulthood, like an ancient shadow that never completely broke. Now, after these stories, we move on to another kind of fear, a more subtle fear, but no less cruel, the idea of purity, of chastity, of imposed sanctity, which fell upon girls like a weight that their fragile bodies could not bear. In many homes, the greatest value placed on a girl was not her joy, nor her strength, nor her thought. It was her purity. Chastity was seen as a silent jewel, invisible but weighty, something to be preserved with vigilance, with rules, with silence, with guilt. From an early age, girls learned to walk modestly, to lower their eyes, to close their legs, to keep quiet about questions. They wore long clothes. They hid their hair. They avoided spontaneous laughter. Every gesture was observed, every deviation interpreted, as if the body carried a constant threat, as if there was guilt in innocence. Virginity was not just a virtue, it was currency, the family's symbolic capital, part of the dowry, a condition for marriage, a criterion for honor, and often an invisible prison, because the girl's body did not belong to her. It was watched by external eyes, by other people's rules, by a morality that did not ask questions. In some religious ceremonies, girls were dressed in white, small veils, flower crowns, hands clasped together. It was the symbol of living purity, of discreet sacrifice, of unspoken promise. They walked down the aisles of the church as brides of something greater, something they might not understand, but that already determined who they should be. They were called angels, saints, lilies, and praised for their sweetness, their obedience, their silence. But behind these compliments there was demand, pressure, the expectation of perfection, of restraint, of eternal docility, as if growing up was just learning to disappear. Stories of child saints circulated in churches, legends of girls who died without touching a man, who resisted sin, who fasted until they wasted away. They were presented as an example, as a goal, as a mirror, and the children listened, absorbed, tried to fit in. But the body, even hidden, existed. It grew, it felt. And when something got out of control, punishment came. Sometimes physical, sometimes moral. A harsh word, isolation, exposed shame. The girl was taught to be ashamed of herself, to accuse herself, to contain herself. There were girls who offered themselves to seclusion even before puberty, motivated by faith, fear, or family imposition. They lived in seclusion, praying, embroidering, fasting. Some found meaning in others, just an escape from poverty, from pain, from early marriage. But in all cases, the body was erased, and even outside of orders, the weight of purity shaped life. The words spoken in the village, the whispers, the judgments, the constant fear of a stain, of a doubt, of a mistake, because a single deviation could cost everything. Name, destiny, acceptance, and often protection. But there was resistance, disguised, silent. A girl who ran barefoot even without permission, who smiled when no one was looking, who wrote thoughts on hidden pieces of fabric, who dreamed, and in dreaming, she gently disobeyed the rules of time. And it is this thread of dream that we now follow, because beyond the requirement of purity, there was another risk, darker, more unpredictable, when the imaginary of evil turned against the child itself, when even a sneeze could be a sign of a spell, and the breeze, an accusation of witchcraft. There were times when evil seemed to have a face, a name, a smell in the air, plague, drought, but harvest. All of these needed an explanation. And when adults could not find answers, their eyes turned to the smallest, to the fragile, to the different, to the children. The The fear of witchcraft over the villages like a constant fog. And in this fear, any gesture could be misinterpreted. A child who dreamed out loud, who talked to herself, who knew the names of plants, who woke up screaming, who stared at the fire too much. It only took a little for suspicion to arise. There were reports of girls being accused of witchcraft before the age of 10. Children being blamed for mysterious illnesses, for the deaths of chicken, for colds that lasted longer than normal. And when these suspicions arose, the atmosphere changed. The silence grew denser. The looks became harder. Affection disappeared. The accusation did not come with evidence. It came with fear. And fear was contagious. The child's behavior began to be monitored. His words were repeated with suspicion. His drawings were interpreted as symbols of evil. Even his laughter could be a sign of a pact with occult forces. The rituals for expelling evil varied. In some regions, the child was forced to fast. In others, they were forced to drink mixtures of bitter herbs. And there were places where the methods were more severe. The body was marked, tested, interrogated. Suffering was seen as purification. As proof, some were taken out of the village, tied to posts, abandoned in forests, or even given to the flames. Children who could barely write, who still mixed up words, who dreamed of horses and flowers, who didn't even know what sin was, but who were treated as threats. Not all of them died. Some survived, but the mark remained. The rejection, the shame, the separation. They grew like ghosts, with the weight of a guilt they never understood, and with a fear of themselves that they could never name. Superstition went hand in hand with ignorance, and ignorance was disguised as zeal, as faith, as protection. Adults believed they were saving the community, that they were protecting others, but often they were just trying to escape their own fear, and in doing so, they sacrificed their innocence. Even so, there were those who doubted, those who hid, those who welcomed. Some mothers protected their daughters in silence. Some neighbors offered bread. A priest refused to report. And in these small gestures, there was resistance, there was compassion, there was hope, because what was at stake was not just safety. It was the soul. The belief that evil inhabited the body of a child was more than absurd. It was tragic, and yet it persisted for centuries, fueled by fear, by control, by a desperate desire to find someone to blame for what could not be controlled. Now, as we leave these stories behind, we carry with us the memory of the children who were not heard, who were silenced in pain, and yet they are part of our history. Their names have been lost, but their presence echoes. And it is with this echo that we continue. Because, besides the accusation, there was another type of violence. The one that arrived with the sound of boots, with the smell of blood, with the march of armies. When war crossed the villages, and the boys stopped being boys. The war did not knock on the door. It passed through, like a strong wind, like a plague, like a shadow that swallows everything. The children were not spared. They were not left aside. They were on the path, in the middle, in the fields, on the street, in people's laps, on the ground. As the armies approached, the air changed. The silence grew heavier. Mothers gathered their children. Fathers hardened their eyes. And everyone knew that something would break. Maybe the house, maybe the routine, maybe the body, maybe the soul. For boys, the risk was twofold. They could be taken, to serve, to fight, to carry, to follow orders. There were battles that used children as shields, as bait, as warnings, not out of military strategy, but out of cruelty, out of contempt for power. The so-called Children's Crusade was one such moment. Thousands of boys, some as young as 12, were gathered together with the promise of liberating the Holy Land. Guided by faith, or by the faith of adults, they marched for days, weeks, without food, without shelter. Many died. Others were sold. Some disappeared. The idea of a holy war, fought by innocents, seemed sacred. But it was tragic. It was a displacement of blame, a transfer of responsibility, as if the salvation of the world could fall on shoulders that had barely learned to bear their own name. Even far from the battlefields, war was still spreading. In the invaded villages, in the burned barns, in the trampled crops, the soldiers arrived like a storm. They took what they wanted. They took what they could. And they left a trail of bodies and fear. The girls were often the first to suffer, raped, silenced, eliminated. Their names did not always make it into the story, but their eyes remained in the memories of their families, on the stained floor, in the silence of the following nights, in the prayers whispered without faith. The children saw the bodies. They smelled the blood, the smoke. They grew up knowing the sound of steel, the weight of grief, the absence of their siblings, the empty gaze of their mothers, and all of this was absorbed as part of the world, as if war were an inevitable winter that always returned, that chilled everything. And when there was no more noise, when the armies moved on, The emptiness remained. Destroyed houses, closed roads, families broken, and children trying to rebuild with pieces. A daily life that no longer made sense. Even so, there were gestures of care. Someone who shared bread, who lent a blanket, who told a story to distract, who drew on the ground with a twig. Because, even in devastated land, childhood still tried to exist, still looked for a gap to breathe. The war did not end with the departure of the soldiers. It remained in dreams, in mutilated bodies, in swallowed words, and in the fear of what might come back. And in the midst of all this, some children became adults too quickly, others, mothers. And it is with this painful step that we continue to a time when the child's womb was required, where childhood was interrupted by birth, by pain, by fear. She still played with thread, with pieces of fabric, with invented names, but her breasts began to change, her hips began to ache, and conversations around the table began to include her name, not as a child, but as a woman, and soon as a wife, and sooner than she should have, as a mother. The girl who carried dolls made of straw now carried a body inside her. She didn't always understand how. Sometimes by imposition of an early marriage, other times by rape, but almost never by choice. And even so, the world expected strength from her. Resignation. Silence. The child's body was not ready. The pains came early. The contractions were more violent. The bones, still forming, needed to open, and they were not always able to. Difficult births, bleeding, fevers, delirium. Many died before seeing their child, others later, and those who survived bore scars that could not be seen. Child pregnancy was treated as part of life, as a natural stage, as if the body already knew what to do, but the body didn't know. The soul, even less so. The girl looked at her own belly in astonishment. She felt the baby move, and didn't know whether to smile or cry. It was all at the same time. It was a lot for a small space. For a young age, the midwives did what they could. They used herbs, massages, prayers, but the fear was constant, because the risk was high. Because the girl didn't scream like a woman, she screamed like a child, and that hurt those who watched, or at least those who still allowed themselves to feel. After the birth, another journey came. The care, the breastfeeding, the baby's crying, the sleepless night. All of this fell on someone who, until yesterday, still needed to be held. And now she offered it, with small hands, with frightened eyes, with shy gestures. There was no truce, no time to process. The girl mother needed to care and keep quiet. If she cried, she was reprimanded. If she got sick, she was ignored. If she asked for help, she was treated as ungrateful, because the role of a mother required sacrifice, even if she was the one sacrificing her own childhood. Some girls lost their children early. Infant mortality was high, and yet mourning was expected with composure, with acceptance, with faith, as if pain did not fit with age, as if it were forbidden to grieve too much, as if the absence of the baby would also erase the pain of loss. But the pain remained, in silence, in the form of memories, in the form of fear, in the form of silence repeated for years. Many of these girls became silent women, rigid, who said little about themselves, who allowed themselves to feel little, because feeling too much was dangerous. It was a reminder, and yet there was tenderness, in small gestures, in eyes that met, in songs sung in whispers, in hands that caressed without really knowing how. The girl learned to love while it hurt, and this love, many times, was what kept her standing. We now continue with this memory, and with the awareness that, for many, faith was the only consolation, but also, at times, a new prison. Faith was everywhere, in the broken bread, in the accepted pain, in the water that ran down the baby's forehead, in the fear of divine punishment. Religion shaped time, behavior, destiny, and for children, it was both comfort and protection, refuge and vigilance. From a young age, they learned to pray, to make the sign of the cross, to fear hell, to hope for heaven, to know that God saw everything, and that the saints heard, and that mistakes had eternal weight. This gave structure, but it also took away the breath, because the child's soul still did not understand the limits between guilt and innocence. Some children felt a real fervor, a genuine desire to please the divine. They fasted on their own. They avoided words that seemed sinful. They knelt in silence for long minutes, and sometimes they thought they saw signs, a light, a sound, a shiver, a touch. These experiences were celebrated. Visions became proof of sainthood. Fever, a gift. Paleness, a sign. Children were treated as chosen, as special. But along with the recognition came the burden, the demand, the expectation. Life ceased to be theirs. There were girls who bled from their hands and feet, who said they heard voices, who cried during prayer, and this was seen as a miracle. It was told by the priests. It was written down by the monks. It was passed from village to village. But no one asked if there was pain, if there was fear, if there was will, because faith, for children, was a narrow path. There was no room for doubt or questioning. The catechism was memorized like poetry. Confessions were made with shame. Sins were imagined and multiplied. Many times, the child confessed things he did not even understand, and even those who saw nothing, who heard no voices, still lived under the eyes of the sacred. Symbols were everywhere. The cross above the door, the image of the saint in the kitchen, the candle lit before childbirth, the blessing upon leaving the house, the prayer before going to sleep. It was a sacred world, and that could be welcoming, but it could also be frightening, because religion said what was right and what was wrong, and when in doubt, it was better to keep quiet, better to obey, better to bow down. The body was a temple, the mind, divine property, the will, something to be tamed. Children grew up trying to fit into this mold, trying to be good, pure, without flaws, but they failed, because they were human, because they were small, and when that happened, punishments came, penance, harsh words, the fear of eternal damnation, the dread of purgatory, the terror that a simple lie could lead to the fire, and that hurt more than any rod. Even so, there was light, there was faith that calmed, that healed, that protected. There were old men who told stories of saints with tenderness, women who taught prayers like lullabies, gestures that warmed, words that comforted. Religion was also a lab. It was also a home. And it is with this delicate balance that we continue, because after faith came the end, and this end was not always dignified, because, for many children, even rest was denied, even death invisible. The last breath of a medieval child was not always noticed. Sometimes it came at dawn, other times while working, in the mother's lap, in the corner of the barn, on the floor of the church. The body slowly cooled, and the silence, which had become part of their routine, became absolute. When an adult died, the bells rang, prayers echoed. Burial was a rite, a passage, a memory. But when a child died, there wasn't always time for this. If the child was very young, if he or she hadn't been baptized, the body was considered soulless, without entry into heaven, without the right to sacred ground. They were called little angels, but not with tenderness, with distance, with an attempt at theological comfort. The bodies were wrapped in cloths, placed in baskets, and hurriedly taken to the back of the fields, buried near trees, walls, paths, without a cross, without a name, without a memory. Many parents could not cry. The pain was private. It was kept to themselves, because mourning was not allowed in its entirety. It was seen as weakness, as insubordination to the divine will. It was necessary to accept, to kneel, to pray, to follow. The suffering was intimate, and therefore more solitary. Some improvised rituals. They placed a piece of bread next to the body, a toy made of straw, a strand of the mother's hair. Small gestures to try to give dignity to the farewell, to ensure that the oblivion was not complete, to say, in some way, that life existed. Children who died at an older age were given discreet burial, a priest, a handful of earth, a repeated psalm. But the weight of the silence was the same. The words were hurried, the whole shallow, and the world went on, as if the loss were part of the contract, of the cycle, of the order. The brothers didn't understand. Sometimes they would ask, "Where is he? When will he be back?" And the answers came in the form of prayers, of metaphors, of cuts, because explaining death was difficult, and accepting it even more so. But time erased it, like rain erases the marks on the earth. Even so, some families remembered. Every year, on the same day, they lit a candle. They whispered a name. They left a piece of bread on the corner of the table. Small acts of resistance against forgetting, against erasure, against the habit of moving on without looking back. The absence of these graves also said a lot. It spoke of the precariousness of childhood, of the place it occupied, or did not occupy, of the way society dealt with fragility, with mourning, with the brevity of life. And yet, there were flowers, wild ones, growing in the fields where the little bodies lay, as if nature, in silence, was giving what humanity had denied. A little color, a gesture of care, a green blanket to cover what time had failed to protect. The night lengthened, the body rests, and everything we hear now seems softer, more distant, as if those stories, so hard and forgotten, had become echoed, not like screams, but like murmurs that pass through time with delicacy, with reverence. Over the course of these hours, we walked together through muddy alleys, dark barns, cold churches, and devastated fields. We touched the silence of cramped rooms, the fear hidden in prayers, the shy affection of small gestures, and the absence that so often took up more space than any present. We saw children who did not play, who did not dream, who were not called by their proper names, only numbers, functions, servants, brides, vows, coins, punishment. Childhood was, for centuries, a terrain of survival, and yet, within, breaths flourished. Small glimmers of humanity. Maybe tonight, when you close your eyes, you will feel it differently. Maybe the image of a barefoot child in the snow will come back to you. Or of a girl holding a baby she didn't ask for. Or of a boy looking up at the sky without knowing what hope was. These memories are not yours, but somehow they are too. Because, deep down, we all carry something of these stories. A sadness that we don't know where it comes from. An ancient silence. A desire to care for what has been hurt. And by remembering these nameless childhoods, perhaps we will learn to give more names to our own, and to the children who still walk among us. History is never just what is in books. It is also what pulsates in absence, in what was not written, in faces without portraits, in bodies without graves, in muffled cries, in smiles that no one saw. And that is why telling these stories is important, so that, even if it is late, they are heard. If this story touched you, well, there are many others waiting to be whispered. Some sleep in ancient manuscripts, others in the silence of forgotten archives, and still others live in the dreams we have without knowing why. And when I close my eyes, maybe they will come, slowly, unhurriedly, the small hands of the Middle Ages, looking for a hike they never had. And now, maybe they can find it, even if for a moment, even if in thought. Good night, and see you soon.